Unity platform existed in what Daniel Torres privately thought of as maximum capacity plus 10%. A state of perpetual overcrowding where every corridor felt like rush hour and personal space became a theoretical luxury mentioned in station regulations but rarely experienced in practice. The massive diplomatic facility orbited the binary stars of the threshold system, chosen as a neutral meeting ground for three species attempting to negotiate peace after 15 years of conflicts that had created the largest refugee crisis in recorded galactic history. Daniel's job as systems technician involved keeping the environmental processors running despite being pushed beyond their design specifications, maintaining communication networks that carried diplomatic exchanges in 7 languages simultaneously, and performing what he'd started calling aggressive preventative maintenance on systems that were one failed component away from catastrophic breakdown. Torres, we've got another atmospheric imbalance in Section 12, came the voice of his supervisor through the comm system. Third one this week. The K-Rith delegation is complaining about oxygen levels that make them feel like they're suffocating. On it, Daniel replied, already pulling up the environmental diagnostics while navigating through a corridor packed with diplomatic staff, security personnel, and what appeared to be a tour group of neutral observers who'd come to witness the historic peace process, and were mostly just witnessing a lot of standing around in crowded hallways. The atmospheric imbalance was another symptom of the station's fundamental problem. It had been designed for a maximum capacity of 10,000 occupants, but the peace negotiations had brought over 15,000 people to Unity platform, all of them producing carbon dioxide and consuming oxygen, while the environmental processors struggled to keep pace with demand that exceeded their engineering specifications. Daniel made the necessary adjustments, balancing oxygen production across multiple zones while trying not to think about how the entire station was basically one large-scale engineering compromise held together by technical expertise and increasingly creative interpretations of safety margins. Environmental balance restored in Section 12, he reported. Though I should mention that we're running the processors at 130% of recommended capacity. At some point, physics is going to object to our ambitious approach to life support. Noted. Just keep everything running until the peace treaty gets signed, and we can reduce station population to something approaching reasonable levels. Any idea when that might be? The negotiations have been stuck on refugee resettlement protocols for 3 months. Your guess is as good as mine. Daniel returned to his workspace, a small technical bay that had somehow remained relatively uncrowded, because most people didn't find environmental control systems particularly interesting. He reviewed the maintenance schedules, noting that nearly every major system on the station was operating beyond its intended parameters, while diplomatic discussions continued without apparent progress toward the agreements that would actually allow refugees to return home or resettle in safe territories. The mandatory station-wide assembly was announced 6 hours later, requiring every person on Unity platform to attend regardless of their actual role in peace negotiations. Daniel had learned to tolerate these assemblies as necessary political theater, though he developed the skill of finding seats in the back corners, where he could review technical reports on his tablet, while various officials gave speeches about progress that never quite seemed to translate into actual implementation of humanitarian agreements. The assembly hall was a massive amphitheater designed with impressive acoustics and sightlines that ensured everyone could see the speakers, which meant it also ensured that Daniel had to navigate through thousands of people to find his preferred corner position. He arrived early, securing a seat that offered the optimal combination of acceptable viewing angle and minimal probability of being directly addressed by anyone seeking public participation in diplomatic ceremony. The hall filled steadily, bodies pressing into available space with the kind of resigned efficiency that characterized all movement on an overcrowded station. Daniel watched the crowd while pretending to review maintenance logs, noting the clear separation between species delegations. The security personnel positioned to intervene if proximity led to the kind of tension that sometimes erupted when 15,000 people from 3 recently hostile civilizations shared insufficient space for extended periods. He was adjusting the environmental controls in his section. The assembly hall's atmospheric processors were struggling with the sudden influx of attendees when someone sat down beside him. Not near him, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched despite several nearby seats being technically available. Daniel glanced over, noting pointed ears and subtle bioluminescent patterns tracing along skin that appeared otherwise human, marking the woman as K-Rith, one of the species most affected by the refugee crisis. She was younger than most of the diplomatic staff, perhaps late 20s by human reckoning, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light and eyes that shifted between green and gold depending on the viewing angle. Her clothing combined traditional K-Rith design with practical utility, and she carried herself with the kind of careful composure that Daniel associated with people who were constantly aware of being observed. "Sorry," Daniel said quietly, starting to shift to give her more space. "I can move over if." She turned to face him directly, close enough that he could see the complex patterns of bioluminescence pulsing gently along her neck and jaw. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for him despite the thousands of people surrounding them. "My people say you're mine now." Daniel froze, his technical mind attempting to process the statement through multiple interpretive frameworks. Mistranslation, cultural idiom that meant something completely different than the literal words suggested, very forward romantic advance delivered with remarkable confidence. "I what?" He managed, aware that his response was profoundly inadequate for whatever situation he'd just been placed in. "You accepted proximity when separation was available," she continued in the same quiet tone. "You maintained contact when withdrawal was possible. You sit in isolation during witnessed assembly. These are the conditions of kinship claim in my culture." Kinship claim. The binding of consort witnesses through chosen proximity and verbal declaration. Her eyes held his with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating his reaction with considerable interest. "My name is Aelith Rinshara, and according to K-Rith law that has been formally registered with station authorities, you are now bonded to me with all rights and responsibilities that entails." Around them, the assembly was beginning, with diplomatic officials taking positions on the central platform, while the crowd settled into attentive silence. But Daniel was acutely aware that every K-Rith delegate in their section had shifted their attention toward him and Aelith, their expressions suggesting they were witnessing something significant rather than simply two people sitting too close in a crowded assembly. "I think," Daniel said carefully, his technical training completely inadequate for this situation, "there's been some sort of misunderstanding. I'm just a systems technician. I don't have any authority or standing in diplomatic proceedings." "You have technical authority over environmental systems that keep refugees safe," Aelith replied. "You have maintained station operations with integrity despite opportunities for the kind of casual corruption that characterizes much of Unity Platform's administration. And you chose isolation during assembly, making your acceptance of my proximity a clear signal of compatibility. I chose isolation because I prefer quiet corners where I can review maintenance reports without being bothered by diplomatic theater." "Exactly. You prioritize function over performance, competence over appearance, reliability over political positioning." Aelith's smile suggested she'd been hoping for exactly this kind of practical response. "These are the qualities K-Rith kinship recognizes as worthy of the highest honor our people can offer." Daniel looked around the assembly hall, noting that the K-Rith delegates' attention had attracted notice from human and other species observers, creating ripples of curiosity through the crowd that suggested something unusual was happening even if most people didn't understand what. What exactly does kinship claim mean in practical terms? He asked, fairly certain he wasn't going to like the answer but needing to understand what he'd apparently agreed to by sitting in his usual corner spot. It means, Aelith said, her voice carrying formal weight despite the quiet delivery, that we are now bonded as consort witnesses with joint authority over K-Rith refugee corridor access and shared command of humanitarian resources. It means our fate is intertwined, our decisions carry equal weight, and our partnership supersedes external political pressure from either of our governments. Because I let you sit next to me in a crowded assembly. Because you accepted proximity when separation was available, maintained contact despite discomfort, and demonstrated through months of reliable technical work that you possess the competence and integrity K-Rith culture values above all other qualities. Aelith's expression grew more serious. The claim isn't impulsive, Daniel Torres. It's recognition of compatibility that's been carefully evaluated according to protocols that your culture doesn't share but that mine considers essential for identifying worthy partnerships. On the central platform, speakers were beginning their remarks about progress toward lasting peace, but Daniel was barely processing their words. His mind was racing through implications, trying to understand how routine technical maintenance and a preference for quiet corners had somehow led to being bonded to an alien woman, whose people apparently measured relationships through proximity rather than formal courtship. And if I don't want to be claimed, he asked, then you stand up and leave now before the assembly concludes, Aelith replied calmly. Withdrawal before witnessed assembly ends invalidates the claim without dishonor to either party, but remaining seated until conclusion constitutes acceptance of the bond. Daniel looked at the packed assembly hall, calculating the social disruption of trying to leave through thousands of seated people, then back at Aelith, whose expression suggested she'd anticipated this exact consideration. You chose a seat position that makes withdrawal practically impossible without causing significant disruption, he observed. I chose a seat position that demonstrates serious intent, Aelith corrected. If you truly wish to refuse the claim, K-Rith custom requires that witnesses assist your departure regardless of disruption. But if you're simply uncomfortable with unexpected social complexity, then remaining seated until assembly concludes would indicate you're willing to learn what partnership might mean when built on mutual respect rather than political convenience. Daniel sat very still, aware that the next 2 hours of diplomatic speeches would determine whether he remained a quiet systems technician or became joint administrator of humanitarian resources with an alien woman whose culture he barely understood, and whose people apparently measured trust through proximity during crowded assemblies. You could have warned me, he said finally, before sitting down and declaring that your people say I'm yours. Would you have believed me, or would you have dismissed it as mistranslation or cultural misunderstanding? Probably the latter, Daniel admitted. Then it's fortunate I demonstrated rather than explained, Aelith replied. K-Rith kinship is formed through action, not discussion. The only question now is whether you choose to remain seated and accept what proximity has created, or stand and walk away from partnership that could reshape humanitarian operations across 3 civilizations. As speakers droned on about frameworks and protocols, and the careful language of diplomatic progress that never quite led to actual refugee resettlement, Daniel reflected that his preference for quiet corners had led him into the most complicated situation of his career, and that he had approximately 2 hours to decide whether unexpected proximity might be the foundation for something considerably more significant than routine technical maintenance. Around them, the K-Rith delegates watched with obvious interest, their attention suggesting they considered whatever happened next to be of considerable importance to their people's future. And Daniel Torres, systems technician who'd always preferred to remain invisible in crowded spaces, discovered that sometimes isolation gets disrupted by people who recognize competence in unexpected places and measure compatibility through the simple act of choosing to sit beside you and declare what their culture has apparently been observing all along. Daniel remained seated through the entire assembly, though whether this was due to genuine acceptance of the kinship claim or simply because standing up and pushing through thousands of people seemed more disruptive than dealing with whatever complications would follow was something he hadn't entirely sorted out yet. Aelith stayed beside him, their shoulders touching in what Daniel was beginning to understand was deliberate rather than coincidental given the available space. The speeches covered familiar territory, progress toward lasting peace, commitment to humanitarian principles, the complex challenges of refugee resettlement that required careful coordination between species whose recent hostilities made cooperation difficult. What the speakers didn't mention was that resettlement agreements kept failing at the final implementation stage, with technical difficulties and procedural complications somehow preventing the actual opening of safe corridors despite months of supposed diplomatic consensus. "Your atmospheric systems in Section 12, Aelith said quietly during one particularly tedious speech about procedural frameworks. They've been experiencing recurring imbalances for 3 weeks. Always the same pattern, always requiring manual intervention." Daniel glanced at her, surprised. "You've been monitoring environmental system reports. I've been observing your work. The patterns are suspicious, malfunctions that occur regularly enough to require constant attention, but never catastrophic enough to trigger automatic investigation protocols." Her eyes held his. "Someone's been deliberately introducing minor failures that keep you too busy maintaining basic operations to notice larger patterns." "What kind of larger patterns?" "Communication delays, authorization routing that adds processing time to humanitarian agreements, technical complications that make implementation of refugee corridors appear impossible despite diplomatic consensus." Aelith pulled up a data display on her tablet, showing system logs that Daniel recognized from his own maintenance work. "You've been fixing symptoms while someone profits from the disease." Daniel studied the data, his technical training automatically identifying the patterns she was indicating. The malfunctions did follow suspicious rhythms, creating constant low-level crises that consumed administrative resources without appearing coordinated. "If what you're suggesting is true, then someone's been sabotaging Unity Platform's operations to prevent refugee resettlement," Aelith finished. "Keeping people displaced while processing contracts generate revenue for corporations that profit from humanitarian crisis." The assembly concluded with standard diplomatic courtesies, and the crowd began its slow dispersal through exits that weren't designed for 15,000 simultaneous departures. Daniel and Aelith remained seated, letting the initial rush pass while Daniel processed both the implications of her analysis and the growing awareness that remaining through the full assembly had apparently confirmed his acceptance of the kinship claim. "So now what happens?" he asked. "Now we report to Karith diplomatic coordination for formal registration of the claim. You receive notification from your supervisors that your role has been somewhat elevated beyond systems technician, and both our governments begin scrambling to understand the political implications of what proximity has created." Aelith stood, offering her hand to help him up, another gesture that Daniel suspected carried more cultural weight than simple courtesy. "Also, you'll probably want to prepare for considerable attention from people who preferred you remain invisible." The notification from his supervisor arrived before they'd even left the assembly hall. "Tours, report to administrative coordination immediately, and bring whoever the Karith woman is who's been sitting with you." "That was fast," Daniel observed. The K-Rith delegation informed station authorities of the claim activation within minutes of my declaration, Alith explained. Your government has likely been reviewing the legal implications since then, trying to determine whether they can annul what proximity has created. The administrative coordination turned out to be a crowded conference room filled with officials from multiple species, all of whom looked at Daniel with expressions ranging from confusion to calculation. His supervisor, Chief Engineer Marks, appeared to be suppressing the urge to either laugh or resign in frustration. Tors, Marks began with careful control. Would you like to explain why the K-Rith delegation is claiming you've been bonded to one of their people through kinship ritual that grants you joint authority over humanitarian resources? I sat in my usual corner during the assembly, Daniel replied. Apparently, that was more culturally significant than I realized. More significant. Human diplomatic coordinator Williams stepped forward, her expression suggesting this was exactly the kind of complication she didn't need added to already complex negotiations. Mr. Tors, the K-Rith kinship claim is one of the most powerful legal bonds in their culture. It grants automatic authority that supersedes normal bureaucratic channels, creates shared command over resources worth billions, and makes both parties effectively immune to political pressure from their respective governments. Because I accepted proximity during a crowded assembly. Because you demonstrated qualities K-Rith culture values, Alith corrected, moving to stand beside Daniel with the kind of partnership positioning that suggested she had no intention of allowing his government to separate them. Reliability, integrity, competence without corruption. These are what kinship recognizes, not simple physical proximity. And you've been evaluating Mr. Tors for how long? Williams asked. 8 weeks. Since I noticed his refusal to participate in the casual equipment requisition fraud that supplements most technicians' income, and his consistent prioritization of refugee safety over administrative convenience. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of that statement. Equipment requisition fraud, Mark said carefully. Approximately 40% of Unity Platform's technical staff inflate maintenance requirements to generate surplus equipment that gets sold to corporate contractors, Alith said calmly. It's considered normal practice, barely worth investigating. Daniel Tors is one of the few who doesn't participate, which is why his requisitions are always accurate and why refugees in his assigned sections experience fewer life support failures than average. Daniel felt several people's attention shift from Alith to him, their expressions suggesting they were recalculating assumptions about the quiet technician who'd always seemed content with routine maintenance work. Is this true, Tors? Marks asked. I requisition what I actually need, Daniel replied. Seemed like the logical approach to equipment management. And you never mentioned that 40% of the technical staff was committing requisition fraud. I assumed it was being monitored by people whose job involved oversight rather than atmospheric processing. Daniel looked around the room at officials whose expressions suggested oversight hadn't been their priority. Was I wrong? The uncomfortable silence that followed answered his question. The kinship claim stands, came a new voice from the doorway. Elder K. Thurith of the K-Rith High Council entered with the kind of formal authority that made everyone else's diplomatic credentials look like training exercises. It has been witnessed by representatives of all 3 species, accepted through Mr. Tor's choice to remain seated through witnessed assembly, and registered in accordance with Unity Platform's recognition of K-Rith cultural protocols. Elder K. Thurith, Williams began diplomatically. Surely we can discuss whether this claim should be ratified given the unusual circumstances. There's nothing unusual about recognizing competence and integrity through cultural observation, the elder interrupted. What's unusual is that your people apparently view basic honesty as remarkable rather than expected, and that you're more concerned about political implications than the fact that Aelith's claim has given her and Mr. Tor's joint authority to open refugee corridors that have been deliberately kept closed, while various parties profit from extended displacement. Deliberately kept closed. Williams's carefully maintained diplomatic composure showed cracks. That's a serious allegation. It's a documented pattern, Aelith said, activating the data display she'd shown Daniel earlier. Communication delays, technical complications, authorization routing that introduces processing lags, all designed to make refugee resettlement appear impossible despite diplomatic consensus. The evidence painted a damning picture of systematic sabotage, spanning months of failed implementation, with technical malfunctions that served corporate profit margins rather than humanitarian needs. If this is accurate, Mark said slowly, then someone's been using our technical systems to prevent the very agreements we're supposed to be facilitating. Someone's been profiting from humanitarian crisis while we perform political theater, Aelith corrected. And now Daniel Tors and I have joint authority that bypasses the bureaucratic channels they've been manipulating. Daniel looked at the assembled officials, seeing the mixture of concern and calculation that suggested he'd somehow become important without trying, simply by being competent at routine technical work and sitting in his usual corner during a crowded assembly. So what happens now? He asked. Now, Elder Cathurith said with satisfaction, you and Aelith use your joint authority to open the refugee corridors, while your respective governments scramble to understand how an administrative technician and a junior K-Rith observer have suddenly become the most important partnership on Unity platform. As officials began arguing about procedures and implications, and the proper protocols for acknowledging kinship claims that disrupted carefully balanced political dynamics, Daniel reflected that his preference for quiet corners had been thoroughly disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important partnerships are formed not through formal courtship, but through the simple recognition that competence and integrity matter more than political positioning, and that choosing to sit beside someone during a crowded assembly can reshape humanitarian operations in ways that years of diplomatic negotiations somehow failed to accomplish. The K-Rith kinship registration ceremony was scheduled for the following morning, giving Daniel approximately 16 hours to process the fact that his technical expertise with atmospheric processors had somehow qualified him for joint administration of interstellar humanitarian operations. He spent most of those hours in his workspace, analyzing the patterns Aelith had shown him, and discovering that the sabotage was considerably more sophisticated than initial examination suggested. The communication delays aren't random, he explained to Aelith when she arrived at his technical bay carrying data pads and what appeared to be several generations' worth of failed humanitarian agreements. They're algorithmically generated to introduce just enough processing time to make coordination between species appear difficult without being obvious manipulation. Can you trace the source? Already have. The delays are being introduced through secondary routing protocols that most administrators don't even know exist. Daniel pulled up network architecture that showed layers of redundant systems built into Unity Platform's communications infrastructure. Someone with very high-level access has been modifying routing tables to ensure that humanitarian authorizations get processed slowly, while commercial traffic moves at normal speed. Aelith studied the data with the focused attention of someone who'd been suspecting conspiracy but needed technical proof. How high level? Station administration or higher? These routing protocols require authorization code that only senior officials possess. So we're not talking about casual corruption by low-level staff. We're talking about systematic sabotage, coordinated from the top of Unity Platform's command structure. Daniel highlighted specific routing modifications, and they've been very careful to make it look like normal technical complexity rather than deliberate obstruction. Until a systems technician who actually understands the architecture started looking at patterns instead of treating each malfunction as isolated incident. Until that, yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Though I have to point out that I'm dramatically unqualified to be exposing administrative conspiracy or taking on joint authority over refugee operations. You're qualified by competence, integrity, and Karith cultural recognition, Aelith replied, settling into the workspace's second chair with casual familiarity that suggested she'd already decided this technical bay was now shared territory. Also, you're qualified by necessity, since the people who should be doing this work have been compromised by the system you just exposed. That's not particularly reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring, it's meant to be honest. Aelith activated her own data display, showing financial records that complemented Daniel's technical analysis. While you were tracing communication sabotage, I was following money. The corporations profiting from refugee processing have been making regular payments to shell companies linked to Unity platform administrators. How regular? Monthly for the past 18 months. Perfectly timed to coincide with each failed attempt to implement corridor access agreements. Daniel studied the financial flows, his technical mind automatically identifying patterns. These payment schedules correlate with the introduction of new routing delays. Every time diplomatic progress threatens actual implementation, a new set of technical complications appears, and another payment gets processed. Exactly. We're not looking at isolated corruption. We're looking at coordinated conspiracy to maintain profitable humanitarian crisis. The implications settled over them like atmospheric pressure building before a storm. Unity platform wasn't just experiencing bureaucratic inefficiency. It was being actively manipulated to prevent the refugee resettlement that thousands of displaced people desperately needed. If we expose this, Daniel said quietly, we're accusing senior officials of crimes that could collapse the entire peace process. If we don't expose it, the peace process remains collapsed while people suffer and corporations profit. Aelith's expression grew determined. The kinship claim wasn't just about recognizing your competence, Daniel. It was about creating legal authority that can't be overridden by the people we're about to accuse. That's why you activated the claim now. You needed a partner with technical expertise who wasn't part of the administrative structure, and Karith law gave you the authority to bind us together despite my complete lack of diplomatic standing. I needed a partner I could trust who understood Unity Platform's technical systems well enough to prove what I'd been suspecting for months. Aelith smiled slightly. The fact that you're also someone whose proximity doesn't make me question my judgment about human reliability was fortunate additional factor. So the whole, my people say you're mine now declaration was calculated strategy. The declaration was formal activation of kinship protocol that requires witnessed assembly, voluntary proximity, and verbal claiming. Her smile grew warmer. Whether my choice to sit beside you specifically was calculated strategy or genuine attraction to competence that doesn't compromise itself for convenience is perhaps more complex question. Daniel found himself almost smiling despite the weight of conspiracy they were about to expose. You Karith have an interesting approach to partnership formation. We believe that important bonds should be formed through demonstrated compatibility, rather than lengthy courtship that can be performed insincerely. Aelith's expression grew more serious. The claim isn't final until the registration ceremony tomorrow. If you truly object to being bonded to someone you barely know for purposes of humanitarian conspiracy exposure, you can still withdraw. And if I withdraw, then I attempt to expose the conspiracy without the technical proof you've provided, probably get dismissed as a junior observer making unfounded accusations, and watch as refugee corridors remain closed, while administrators who have been paid to prevent implementation continue their profitable sabotage. That's not particularly subtle pressure. It's not pressure at all. It's honest assessment of what happens if partnership formed through proximity gets rejected because of conventional concerns about appropriate relationship development timelines. Alith met his eyes directly. "I'm not asking you to love me, Daniel Tors. I'm asking if you're willing to be bound to someone who noticed your competence and decided that K-Rith law should grant us joint authority to do what's right despite political convenience." Daniel looked around his workspace. This technical bay that had been his refuge from diplomatic theater, now transformed into command center for exposing systematic corruption. He thought about 8 months of routine maintenance, of being invisible and content with that invisibility, of prioritizing function over performance, because that's what his technical training had taught him mattered. Then he thought about Alith sitting beside him in a crowded assembly, and declaring that her people recognized what competence meant, what integrity was worth, what partnership could accomplish when built on mutual respect rather than formal courtship protocols. "The registration ceremony," he said finally, "what does it involve?" "Witness declaration of joint authority, formal acceptance of shared responsibility, and ceremonial proximity that demonstrates to both our cultures that kinship has been properly established." Alith's relief was evident. Also, traditional K-Rith blessing that translates roughly as "May your partnership be as reliable as atmospheric processing and as essential as oxygen recycling." That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most technical blessing possible. K-Rith culture views technical reliability as deeply romantic concept, Alith said with obvious amusement. "We're a people who nearly went extinct due to atmospheric system failures. Competent environmental engineering is highest form of love language." Daniel laughed despite himself. "Then I suppose being systems technician accidentally qualified me for K-Rith romantic consideration." Accidentally and deliberately. The best partnerships usually involve both. The conspiracy exposure was scheduled to occur immediately following the kinship registration, transforming what should have been private ceremony into public presentation of evidence that would either reform Unity Platform's operations or destroy what remained of the fragile peace process. "No pressure," Daniel muttered, reviewing the technical documentation one more time. "Consider it appropriate challenge for partnership formed through choosing to sit beside someone in crowded assembly," Alith replied. "If kinship bonds can't handle exposing administrative corruption, they're not worth the ceremonial proximity they're formed through." As they prepared for a ceremony that would either establish them as legitimate authorities or mark them as naive idealists who'd mistaken technical competence for political power, Daniel reflected that his preference for quiet corners had been thoroughly disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important partnerships are announced through whispered declarations in crowded spaces, recognized through proximity that others might mistake for coincidence, and formalized through ceremonies that combine romantic gesture with strategic necessity in ways that reshape humanitarian operations, while accidentally creating bonds that neither party had planned, but both were beginning to appreciate. The kinship registration ceremony took place in Unity Platform's main diplomatic chamber, transformed from private cultural ritual into public demonstration of authority that would either legitimize their conspiracy accusations or mark them as overreaching idealists. Daniel stood beside Alith wearing formal attire that combined human diplomatic convention with K-Rith ceremonial elements, feeling profoundly unqualified for a ceremony that would establish him as joint administrator of humanitarian resources worth billions. "The K-Rith kinship claim," Elder K-Thurith announced to the assembled witnesses representing all 3 species, "bonds 2 individuals through demonstrated compatibility, voluntary proximity, and mutual recognition of essential qualities." Daniel Tors and Alith Rinshara have fulfilled all requirements of traditional claiming, and we gather to witness formal registration of their partnership. Daniel noticed that the crowd included not just diplomatic staff, but also several Unity platform administrators, whose expressions suggested they were very interested in whether this ceremony would proceed, or if human officials would find some procedural reason to invalidate a claim that threatened their carefully arranged conspiracy. Daniel Torres, Elder Kathurith continued, do you accept bonding to Aelith Rinshara with all rights and responsibilities that Kaerith kinship entails? I do, Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. Though I should probably mention that my qualifications consist primarily of atmospheric processor maintenance, and an apparently remarkable ability to requisition only the equipment I actually need. Laughter rippled through the assembly. Genuine shared amusement from witnesses who were watching unprecedented partnership formation, rather than standard diplomatic ceremony. Your qualifications, Aelith said, turning to face him directly, consist of 8 months proving that competence matters more than political positioning, that integrity doesn't require audience approval, and that technical reliability is the foundation upon which humanitarian operations should be built. She placed her hand over his heart, and Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest. Not the dramatic energy transfer some Kaerith ceremonies involved, but the simple recognition of connection that needed no supernatural manifestation to feel profound. I bond with you, Aelith continued, her voice carrying formal harmonics that made the words resonate beyond simple declaration. Not because protocol demands it, not because political necessity requires it, but because proximity revealed what months of observation confirmed, that you are someone whose partnership would honor Kaerith values while serving humanitarian purposes that transcend cultural boundaries. Daniel placed his hand over her heart, feeling the subtle patterns of bioluminescence pulsing beneath his palm, warm and alive with rhythms that suggested emotions considerably more complex than strategic political alliance. I accept bonding to Aelith Rinshara, he said, abandoning his prepared formal response in favor of honesty that felt more appropriate than diplomatic language, because she noticed competence when I was trying to remain invisible, recognized integrity when I thought I was just doing routine work, and chose to sit beside me in a crowded assembly, even though that choice would make both our lives significantly more complicated. He paused, aware that billions were watching this ceremony across 3 civilizations, and that his words would become part of diplomatic record, studied by future xenosociologists, trying to understand how a technician and a junior observer had reshaped interstellar humanitarian operations. Also, he added, because she understands that sometimes the most important partnerships aren't formed through lengthy courtship, but through the simple act of choosing proximity when separation would be easier, and declaring what your culture has recognized even when conventional wisdom would suggest remaining silent. The bond is registered, Elder Kathurith announced. Let it be recorded that Daniel Torres and Aelith Rinshara are kinship bonded with joint authority over Kaerith humanitarian resources and shared responsibility for refugee corridor operations. The formal declarations concluded, but before officials could begin the standard post-ceremony protocols, Aelith activated holographic displays that transformed the diplomatic chamber into presentation space for evidence neither species could ignore. The kinship claim, she announced to the assembled witnesses, grants us authority that supersedes normal administrative channels. We use that authority now to expose systematic sabotage that has prevented refugee resettlement while generating profits for corporations invested in humanitarian crisis. The technical documentation Daniel had compiled appeared in the air above the ceremony platform. Routing protocols modified to introduce delays, communication architectures deliberately misconfigured to prevent coordination, and patterns that proved months of failed agreements weren't due to diplomatic complexity but coordinated obstruction. Unity Platform's communication systems, Daniel explained, his technical expertise suddenly finding public audience, have been systematically altered to ensure humanitarian authorizations process slowly while commercial traffic moves at normal speed. These modifications require high-level administrative access and correlate perfectly with corporate payments to shell companies linked to station officials. Alith's financial analysis appeared alongside his technical evidence, showing the damning correlation between payment schedules and technical complications that had prevented refugee corridor implementation. "We're not alleging isolated corruption," Alith said firmly. "We're documenting coordinated conspiracy that has kept hundreds of thousands displaced, while Unity Platform administrators profit from the processing contracts that extended crisis generates." The diplomatic chamber erupted in controlled chaos, officials demanding verification, neutral observers activating recording systems to document unprecedented accusations, and several Unity Platform administrators, whose expressions suggested they were calculating whether denial or cooperation offered better prospects for minimizing their legal exposure. "These are serious allegations," Station Administrator Chen said carefully. 3 months later, as Daniel reviewed technical specifications for the expanded refugee corridor networks, while Alith coordinated resettlement agreements with newly cooperative administrators from all three species, he reflected on how thoroughly his quiet technical career had been disrupted by someone sitting beside him and whispering 7 words that changed everything. "You're smiling," Alith observed, entering their shared workspace with reports requiring joint authorization. "Either the corridor capacity numbers are exceeding projections, or you're contemplating how absurd our lives have become." "Both," Daniel admitted. "Though I was specifically thinking about how everyone expected me to have a quiet career maintaining atmospheric processors, and instead I got claimed by an alien woman whose whispered declaration in a crowded assembly led to exposing galactic conspiracy and joint administration of humanitarian operations. And do you regret that proximity led to partnership that destroyed your comfortable anonymity?" Daniel looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd recognized competence when he'd thought he was invisible, who'd chosen him as partner before he'd known he was being evaluated, who trusted him with authority he'd never sought but was learning to wield effectively. "Not even slightly," he said, "though I do occasionally wonder what my life would have been like if you'd chosen a different seat during that assembly." "Considerably more boring," Alith replied with certainty, "and significantly less effective at actual refugee resettlement. When you put it that way, being claimed through proximity seems like remarkably efficient partnership formation." "That's because K-Rith culture understands that the best bonds are formed through demonstrated compatibility, rather than extended courtship that can be performed insincerely." Alith moved closer, the kind of comfortable proximity that had developed over months of joint work. "Also, your atmospheric processor maintenance records suggested you had the kind of systematic competence that would translate well to humanitarian coordination. You based partnership decision on my maintenance records. I based partnership decision on months of observation that included your maintenance records, your requisition integrity, your refusal to participate in casual corruption, and the way you chose isolation during assemblies, making your acceptance of my proximity a clear signal of compatibility." Her smile held warmth that suggested evaluation had become genuine affection. The maintenance records were just initial data point. As they returned to reviewing humanitarian coordination reports, Daniel handling technical logistics, while Alith managed diplomatic protocols in the kind of seamless cooperation that characterized their partnership, Daniel reflected that his confusion about being claimed through whispered declaration had evolved into understanding that sometimes the most important partnerships are formed not through formal courtship, but through recognition that competence matters. That proximity reveals compatibility, and that choosing to remain seated beside someone during a crowded assembly can reshape humanitarian operations in ways that years of diplomatic negotiations somehow failed to accomplish. Everyone else might have had conventional partnerships developed through extended courtship and formal compatibility assessments. But Daniel Torres had Alith Rinshara, observer, strategist, and the woman whose whispered words had not only disrupted his comfortable anonymity, but had exposed corruption spanning 3 civilizations, proving that sometimes the most important declarations aren't shouted from platforms, but whispered in crowded assemblies to people whose competence has been carefully evaluated, and whose acceptance of proximity signals compatibility that traditional courtship would have taken years to confirm. And somewhere in the refugee corridors, that their bonding had finally opened. Thousands of families were finding safety because a Karith woman had noticed a human technician's integrity and decided that formal kinship claiming might be exactly the catalyst needed to transform technical competence into humanitarian authority, and that sometimes the best way to announce partnership is to sit beside someone in a crowded space and whisper that your people have already recognized what will take others months to understand. That proximity chosen freely is the foundation of bonds strong enough to reshape the political landscape, while accidentally creating partnerships that neither party planned, but both were learning to cherish. 6 months after the ceremony, when the first major wave of refugee resettlement was declared complete, and Daniel's atmospheric processors were finally operating at reasonable capacity levels, Alith presented him with a gift that perfectly captured their partnership's unusual origins. "It's a holographic recording," she explained, activating the device to show Daniel sitting in his corner during the assembly, reviewing technical reports while completely oblivious to the Karith observer, who'd been carefully positioning herself to claim the competent technician whose maintenance records had suggested he might be exactly the partner her people needed. "You recorded your approach?" Daniel asked with amusement. "I recorded the moment before formal claiming, yes. Karith tradition preserves the instant when proximity becomes partnership." Alith's smile held both affection and satisfaction. "I wanted to remember the expression on your face when you realized that sitting in your preferred corner had made you considerably more visible than comfortable anonymity suggested." That expression was pure confusion, mixed with growing horror at social complexity. "That expression was perfect," Alith corrected. "It showed someone whose competence had been recognized, whose integrity would be honored, and whose acceptance of unexpected proximity would reshape humanitarian operations while creating partnership that neither of us had planned but both were beginning to appreciate." Daniel pulled her close, comfortable with the kind of proximity that had transformed from cultural protocol into genuine affection. "You know, when you sat beside me and whispered that your people said I was yours, I thought it was either mistranslation or the most forward romantic advance I'd ever experienced." "It was formal kinship claiming delivered according to protocols your culture doesn't share," Alith replied. "Also, it was reasonably forward romantic advance wrapped in strategic necessity." "Best kind of romantic advance," Daniel said. "The kind that serves humanitarian purposes while accidentally creating partnerships that transcend the political calculations that brought them together." As they reviewed the final resettlement reports, hundreds of thousands of refugees finally home or safely resettled, because whispered words in a crowded assembly had created authority that corporate conspiracy couldn't override. Daniel reflected that his preference for quiet corners had been permanently disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important bonds are formed through proximity chosen freely, declarations delivered as whispers rather than shouts, and partnerships that begin with, "My